March 1943, when the Atlantic Ocean became a graveyard for Allied vessels. The German U-boat wolf packs hunted merchant convoys relentlessly, turning supply routes into death traps. Operation Drumbeat had already claimed hundreds of ships along the eastern seaboard. The United States Navy responded by deploying destroyer escorts and implementing the Dogs for Defense program. Among the vessels sailing through these treacherous waters was the USS Sentinel, a Fletcher-class destroyer carrying vital intelligence documents to British command. The ship housed a crew of 270 men and one German shepherd named Major. This dog had been donated by a Pennsylvania family through the Dogs for Defense initiative and trained at the War Dog Reception and Training Center in Front Royal, Virginia. Major learned silent commands, explosive detection, and messenger duties during his rigorous 12-week preparation. The dog's handler was Petty Officer Second Class Richard Sullivan from Boston, a communications specialist responsible for encrypting tactical messages. Sullivan had bonded with Major during training exercises at Norfolk Naval Base. The animal demonstrated exceptional intelligence by learning hand signals within days and remaining calm during live-fire drills. Their partnership became essential aboard the Sentinel, where Major served as a morale booster and assisted in guarding sensitive equipment during night watches along the deck. The Sentinel carried documents detailing German naval positions obtained through intercepted communications. These papers contained coordinates for upcoming U-boat patrols and submarine refueling locations near the Azores. British intelligence desperately needed this information to coordinate airstrikes and protect the next convoy departing from New York Harbor. The documents were stored in a waterproof steel case inside the communications room, guarded continuously by armed personnel, and checked every 4 hours by the executive officer. Sullivan understood the mission's gravity as he stood watch that cold March evening. The Atlantic swells rose 15 feet, and fog reduced visibility to mere yards ahead of the bow. Major sat beside him on the deck, ears alert to every sound cutting through the engine rumble and wave crashes. The dog had been restless since dinner, pacing the communications room and whining softly. Sullivan dismissed it as seasickness, though Major had proven himself a capable sailor during previous crossings through rough waters and storms. At 2300 hours, the officer of the deck ordered a course change to avoid a reported ice field drifting south from Greenland. The Sentinel turned northeast, unknowingly sailing directly into the patrol zone of U-boat U-571. The German submarine had been tracking the destroyer for 6 hours, waiting for the perfect angle to launch torpedoes without detection. Captain Klaus Zimmermann studied his periscope readings and calculated the firing solution while his crew loaded 4 torpedoes into the forward tubes, ready to strike the American vessel. The first torpedo struck the Sentinel's port side at 23:42 hours, tearing through the hull below the waterline near the forward magazine. The explosion killed 17 sailors instantly and ignited fuel lines running through the lower decks. Sullivan was thrown against the bulkhead, his shoulder dislocating from the impact. Major tumbled across the deck, but regained his footing immediately, barking once before remembering his training to remain silent. The ship listed 12 degrees to port as water flooded 3 compartments simultaneously. Damage control teams scrambled to seal bulkheads, but the second torpedo hit amidships within 90 seconds, destroying the engine room and killing Chief Engineer Martinez and his entire crew. The Sentinel lost all power, plunging the vessel into darkness except for emergency battery lights flickering weakly in the passageways. Sullivan crawled toward the communications room, his injured shoulder screaming with pain. He knew the documents had to be protected. Major stayed close, occasionally nudging Sullivan's good hand to guide him through the smoke-filled corridor toward their duty station. The communications room was in chaos when they arrived. Lieutenant Commander Barnes lay unconscious beneath a collapsed radio console, bleeding from a head wound. Seaman Thomas attempted to send a distress signal on the backup transmitter, but static filled the speakers. The waterproof case containing the intelligence documents sat on its mount, secured by chains to prevent loss during rough seas. Sullivan grabbed the case with his functional arm and shouted orders to Thomas to abandon the room as water began seeping through the doorframe from the flooding passageway outside. The ship's loudspeaker crackled to life as Captain Morrison ordered all hands to abandon ship. The Sentinel was sinking bow first, already down 25 degrees and taking on thousands of gallons per minute. Crew members rushed topside carrying life jackets and releasing rafts into the freezing Atlantic waters. The temperature hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, giving survivors perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia claimed them. Sullivan struggled up the ladder toward the main deck, the steel case banging against his legs, while Major climbed behind him with remarkable agility despite the severe angle. On deck, chaos reigned as sailors jumped into the ocean or scrambled into overcrowded life rafts. Sullivan reached the starboard rail and looked for options. The nearest raft was already 50 yards away, drifting rapidly in the current. He secured the case's chain around his waist, knowing he could not swim effectively with one arm. Major barked urgently, sensing his handler's hesitation. Sullivan made his decision. He would jump and trust that someone would retrieve both him and the vital intelligence before hypothermia took him into the dark, cold water below. Before Sullivan could leap, a third explosion rocked the Sentinel as the forward magazine finally detonated. The blast wave knocked him unconscious and sent him flying over the rail into the Atlantic. Major jumped after him without hesitation, hitting the water seconds later. The dog surfaced and immediately swam toward Sullivan's floating body. The steel case dragged the unconscious sailor downward, its weight pulling him beneath the waves. Major dove underwater, grabbed Sullivan's collar with his teeth, and pulled upward with all his strength against the terrible weight threatening to drown his handler. Major managed to bring Sullivan's head above the surface, but the steel case continued pulling them both downward. The dog treaded water furiously, his powerful legs churning against the freezing Atlantic swells. Around them, the Sentinel's bow rose vertically as the ship entered its final death throes. Men screamed in the water, calling for help as debris rained down from the exploding destroyer. Sullivan remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Major knew instinctively that he had to remove the weight, or both would drown within minutes in the violent waters. The German shepherd released Sullivan's collar momentarily and dove again, searching for the chain connecting the case to his handler's waist. His training had never covered underwater rescue, but loyalty drove him beyond learned behaviors. Major's teeth found the chain and he pulled, trying to break it loose. The links held firm. He surfaced again, gasping for air, then repositioned Sullivan's body to keep his face above water. A piece of wreckage floated nearby, a wooden door torn from an officer's cabin during the explosion, large enough to support weight. Major swam toward the door, pulling Sullivan along by biting the sailor's jacket. The effort exhausted him, but he reached the floating debris and maneuvered Sullivan's upper body onto it. The door supported the unconscious man's head and shoulders, though the steel case still hung beneath the water, anchored by the chain around Sullivan's waist. Major climbed partially onto the door, resting while maintaining his grip on Sullivan's jacket. The Sentinel disappeared beneath the waves with a terrible groaning sound, creating a whirlpool that sucked floating debris and several swimmers toward the void where the ship once floated. Major barked loudly now, abandoning his silent training to call for help across the dark ocean. Life rafts dotted the water, tiny orange specks barely visible in the moonless night. The nearest raft was perhaps 70 yards away, moving farther with each current shift. Sullivan coughed suddenly, seawater erupting from his lungs as consciousness returned briefly. He felt Major's weight on his back and the wooden door beneath his chest. His training kicked in despite his confusion. The documents. He still felt the chain's weight around his waist. The mission was not yet lost if someone could retrieve them, and the case from the Atlantic depths. Sullivan's hand moved weakly to unclip the chain, but his fingers were already numb from the cold Atlantic water. He could not manipulate the clasp. Major sensed his handler's intention and grabbed the chain in his teeth, pulling it upward to create slack. Sullivan worked the clasp with his remaining strength, his vision blurring as hypothermia began shutting down his body systems. The clasp opened. The steel case slid free from Sullivan's waist and began sinking toward the ocean floor. Major released Sullivan's jacket and dove after the case without thinking, disappearing beneath the dark surface into the freezing depths below them both. The German shepherd descended 10 feet, then 15, his eyes useless in the absolute blackness surrounding him. His lungs burned as water pressure increased against his chest. The case was sinking rapidly, already 20 feet down and accelerating. Major's training had taught him to retrieve objects, to carry messages across battlefields under fire, to never abandon a mission until completion. He kicked harder, descending further until his nose touched metal. His teeth closed around the case's handle. The weight was immense, far heavier than anything he had carried before, but Major began swimming upward with powerful strokes of his legs. Major's ascent was agonizingly slow as the steel case dragged against his upward momentum. His lungs screamed for oxygen, black spots appearing in his vision even underwater. He focused on the faint lighter area above, indicating the surface, kicking with every remaining ounce of strength. His powerful shoulders and legs, developed through months of military training and conditioning, propelled him upward inch by inch. After 30 seconds that felt like hours, his head broke the surface. He gasped desperately for air, nearly losing his grip on the case as waves washed over his face repeatedly in the rough Atlantic conditions. Sullivan had drifted 15 feet away on the wooden door, barely conscious and mumbling incoherently. Major swam toward him with the case clamped firmly in his jaws, its weight making progress difficult. Each wave that struck threatened to tear the case from his mouth or push him under permanently. The dog's determination overrode every physical signal, telling him to release the burden and save himself. He reached the door and attempted to lift the case onto it, but the weight was too great. Instead, Major pushed the case against the door's edge and held it there, keeping it from sinking while maintaining his position next to Sullivan. For 20 minutes, Major held this position while searching the darkness for rescue. His body temperature dropped steadily as the freezing water sapped his core heat. His powerful muscles began cramping and his breathing became labored. Sullivan slipped in and out of consciousness, occasionally whispering Major's name before fading again. The dog refused to release the case despite his exhaustion. Around them, other survivors called out in the darkness, their voices growing weaker as hypothermia claimed victim after victim. The life rafts had drifted far away, seemingly beyond reach for anyone still swimming in the deadly cold Atlantic waters tonight. Then a searchlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the debris field where the Sentinel had gone down. The British destroyer HMS Achilles had detected the U-boat attack on radar and raced to the location at flank speed, arriving 45 minutes after the sinking. The searchlight found clusters of survivors clinging to wreckage and began directing rescue boats toward them. Major barked loudly, a deep, powerful sound that carried across the water. The searchlight swung toward the noise and illuminated the German Shepherd, his handler on the door and the steel case he gripped determinedly in his teeth, despite obvious exhaustion. A rescue boat reached them within minutes. 2 British sailors pulled Sullivan aboard first, wrapping him immediately in wool blankets and beginning first aid for his dislocated shoulder and hypothermia. Then they reached for Major, but the dog refused to release the case. One sailor recognized the marking on the case indicating classified material. He gently took the case from Major's jaws, saying "good dog" repeatedly in a calm voice. Only then did Major allow them to lift him into the boat. He collapsed immediately onto the deck, his body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion, but his eyes remained fixed on the steel case to ensure it stayed safe. Aboard the HMS Achilles, the ship's doctor examined both Sullivan and Major in the sick bay. Sullivan's core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, dangerously close to fatal levels. Major's temperature was even lower at 90 degrees, and his paws showed signs of frostbite. The British captain opened the waterproof case after Sullivan weakly explained its contents. Inside, perfectly dry and intact, were the intelligence documents detailing German U-boat positions and refueling coordinates. The captain immediately radioed the information to British Naval Command, knowing these coordinates could alter the entire Atlantic campaign if acted upon quickly enough by Allied forces. Within 6 hours of receiving the intelligence, British Coastal Command launched Operation Sea Sweep. 12 Wellington bombers equipped with depth charges departed from bases in Northern Ireland and Scotland, targeting the refueling coordinates listed in the recovered documents. At dawn, the aircraft found 3 German submarines surfaced at the rendezvous point, taking on fuel from the supply vessel Nordmark. The Wellingtons attacked immediately, catching the U-boats completely exposed and vulnerable, without time to dive to safety. 2 submarines were sunk outright by depth charges, and the third suffered critical damage, forcing it to surface, where the crew surrendered to a British destroyer arriving minutes later. The captured submarine yielded additional intelligence, including German naval codes and patrol schedules for the entire North Atlantic theatre. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park used this information to decrypt previously unreadable Enigma messages concerning U-boat Wolfpack tactics. Within 2 weeks, Allied convoy losses dropped by 40% as ships could now route around known German patrol areas. The strategic impact was enormous, ensuring that vital supplies continued flowing to Britain and Soviet Russia without the devastating losses experienced throughout 1942. Military historians would later estimate that this intelligence breakthrough shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by several months. Meanwhile, Major recovered slowly in the HMS Achilles sickbay under the care of the ship's medical staff. His frostbitten paws required daily treatment with warm compresses and antiseptic ointment. The British sailors adopted him as their mascot, sneaking him extra rations and taking turns keeping him company during his recovery. Sullivan, in the adjacent bunk, recovered from his hypothermia and dislocated shoulder. The Navy surgeon successfully relocated the shoulder joint and placed Sullivan's arm in a sling to immobilize it during healing. Both patient and dog were declared stable after 5 days at sea. The HMS Achilles arrived at Portsmouth Naval Base on March 28, 1943. A delegation of American and British officers waited on the dock to receive Sullivan and Major. Rear Admiral Thompson of the United States Navy personally pinned a commendation medal on Sullivan's hospital gown, praising his dedication to duty under impossible circumstances. Then the Admiral knelt beside Major, who sat at attention despite his bandaged paws, and fastened a specially commissioned collar bearing the inscription, "For Valor Beyond Duty." Photographers captured the moment for newspapers across America and Britain, turning Major into an overnight symbol of courage and loyalty. The story of the German shepherd who refused to abandon the intelligence documents spread rapidly through military ranks and civilian populations. The Office of War Information used Major's story in recruitment materials for the Dogs for Defense program, resulting in 3,000 additional dogs being donated within 2 months. Major's image appeared on war bond posters with the caption, "Even Our Dogs Fight for Freedom," helping to raise $17 million for the war effort. Sullivan received hundreds of letters from citizens thanking him and Major for their service, many including donations to animal welfare organizations supporting military working dogs. After recovering fully, Sullivan faced a difficult decision regarding Major's future service. Navy regulations required that combat-experienced dogs either return to active duty or be retired to civilian life. Sullivan requested that Major be retired, arguing that the dog had already given more than could be reasonably asked of any animal. The Navy agreed, and Major was officially discharged from military service in May 1943. Sullivan arranged for Major to return to his original family in Pennsylvania, but the family insisted that Sullivan keep the dog permanently, recognizing the unbreakable bond forged between handler and animal during their ordeal in the cold Atlantic waters. Sullivan and Major traveled together to Boston, where the sailor was assigned to shore duty during his shoulder rehabilitation. They moved into a small apartment near the Charlestown Navy Yard, establishing a routine of morning walks along the harbor and afternoon training sessions, where Major practiced his commands to maintain sharpness. The German Shepherd had become mildly famous, recognized frequently on the streets by civilians who read about his heroism in newspapers. Children asked to pet him, and Sullivan always obliged, using these moments to discuss the importance of the Dogs for Defense program and encourage families to support military working dogs. The intelligence Major saved continued producing strategic dividends throughout 1943. Allied forces used the captured German codes to intercept and destroy 5 more supply vessels, attempting to refuel U-boat Wolfpacks in the Atlantic. Without these refueling points, German submarines were forced to return to French ports more frequently, reducing their effective patrol time by 30%. This operational constraint weakened the U-boat threat considerably, allowing larger convoys to cross the Atlantic with reduced escort requirements. More supplies reached Britain and Soviet ports, directly supporting the eventual Allied invasion of Europe planned for the following year. In September 1943, Sullivan received orders to report to the Naval Intelligence Office in Washington for a classified briefing. He and Major took the train south, arriving at the Pentagon, where Captain Harrison of Naval Intelligence explained a new assignment. The Navy wanted Sullivan to help establish a formalized training program for combat messenger dogs based on lessons learned from Major's experience. Sullivan would work with kennels at multiple bases, developing protocols for water rescue training and equipment retrieval under combat conditions. Major would serve as the demonstration dog, teaching other animals and their handlers the techniques that saved the intelligence documents. Sullivan accepted the assignment enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to honor Major's sacrifice by improving survival odds for future dog teams. For the next year, they traveled to training facilities across the United States, demonstrating water rescue techniques and equipment recovery procedures. Major proved to be an excellent teacher, remaining patient as younger dogs learned from watching his demonstrations. Sullivan documented every training session, creating detailed manuals that would be used by military dog trainers for decades after the war ended. Their work resulted in the certification of 120 messenger dog teams by June 1944. The training program arrived just in time for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. 25 dog teams trained by Sullivan and Major participated in the D-Day landings, serving as messengers between beach positions and command ships when radio communications failed due to jamming or equipment damage from enemy fire. These dogs carried critical tactical updates through machine gun fire and artillery barrages, enabling commanders to coordinate movements and call for naval gunfire support. 4 dogs died during the first 2 days of fighting, but their sacrifice saved countless human lives by maintaining communication links during the most critical hours of the invasion. What would you have done if you were in that freezing Atlantic water and saw your best friend, your loyal companion of 4 legs, risking everything to save those documents? Would you have tried to take them yourself, or would you have trusted your partner completely? Tell us in the comments how you would have reacted in those desperate moments. Sullivan later said that Major's decision to dive after the sinking case represented absolute trust in their bond and unwavering commitment to their shared mission, a standard Sullivan spent the rest of his life trying to meet. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, bringing celebrations across the Allied nations. Sullivan and Major were in San Diego at the Naval Training Center when news of Germany's surrender arrived. Sailors threw their caps in the air and embraced each other on the parade ground. Major seemed to sense the joy around him, barking happily and wagging his tail as Sullivan hugged him tightly. The war against Japan continued for 3 more months, but Sullivan's training duties kept him stateside, away from the Pacific combat zones where other dog teams continued serving with Marine and Army units. After Japan's surrender in August, the military began demobilizing rapidly. Thousands of service members returned to civilian life, and the Dogs for Defense program faced decisions about the fate of military working dogs. Of the 18,000 dogs trained for combat, the military planned to retain only a small percentage for peacetime duties. The remaining animals would be returned to their original owners or adopted by their handlers. Sullivan formally adopted Major through military channels, ensuring the German Shepherd would never be separated from him or reassigned to another duty station. Sullivan received his honorable discharge from the Navy in November 1945 with the rank of Chief Petty Officer. He returned to Boston with Major and enrolled at Boston University using the GI Bill, studying education with plans to become a teacher. The transition to civilian life proved challenging for many veterans struggling with combat memories and readjustment difficulties. Sullivan found comfort in Major's presence, and the dog seemed to understand his handler's occasional nightmares about the Sentinel's sinking. On difficult nights, Major would rest his head on Sullivan's chest, his weight and warmth providing reassurance that they had both survived. In 1947, Sullivan graduated with his teaching degree and accepted a position at a Boston elementary school. He brought Major to school frequently as part of history lessons about World War II and the role of animals in military service. Students loved hearing stories about Major's heroism and seeing the special collar he still wore from the British ceremony in Portsmouth. Sullivan used these lessons to teach values of loyalty, courage, and dedication to duty. He never mentioned the freezing water or his own near-death experience, focusing instead on Major's determination and refusal to abandon their mission. Sullivan also became involved with veterans organizations supporting former military dog handlers. Many handlers struggled to obtain recognition for their animal service, as dogs received no official veterans benefits or medical care after discharge. Sullivan testified before Congress in 1949, advocating for legislation to provide veterinary care for retired military working dogs. His testimony, combined with Major's documented heroism, helped pass the Military Working Dog Care Act of 1950, which established funding for lifetime medical care for dogs retired from military service with combat experience or injuries. The impact of that legislation extended far beyond Major's generation. Thousands of military working dogs in subsequent conflicts received proper medical treatment and retirement care because of the precedent established. Sullivan spent his summers volunteering at animal shelters, helping to place retired military dogs with suitable families. Major accompanied him on these visits, his calm demeanor helping nervous dogs adjust to civilian life. Sullivan always emphasized to potential adopters that military dogs needed patient handlers who understood their training and experiences, ensuring successful transitions into peaceful homes far from battlefields. In 1953, Sullivan married Catherine Miller, a librarian who shared his love for animals and education. Catherine embraced Major as part of their family, and the German Shepherd adapted well to the expanded household. The couple purchased a small house in suburban Boston with a large backyard where Major could run freely. By this time, Major was 10 years old, showing signs of aging with grey fur around his muzzle and slower movements during walks. Sullivan knew that their time together was growing limited, but he cherished every day with the dog who saved his life. Sullivan continued teaching and became involved in curriculum development for Massachusetts public schools. He created lesson plans incorporating animal stories into history education, always featuring Major's Atlantic rescue prominently. His students went on to share these stories with their own families, creating ripples of awareness about military working dogs that spread throughout New England. Several students were inspired to join the military themselves, specifically requesting assignments involving working dogs. Sullivan maintained correspondence with many of these former students, advising them on handler techniques and the importance of the human-animal bond. Major's health declined gradually through 1954. He developed arthritis in his hips, likely from the frostbite damage sustained during the Atlantic rescue. Sullivan consulted with the best veterinarians in Boston, using the military working dog medical benefits he had helped establish to ensure Major received proper pain management and treatment. The dog remained cheerful despite his discomfort, greeting Sullivan each evening with tail wags and requesting their customary walk around the neighborhood. Catherine often joined them, the three forming a tight family unit that neighbors admired and children loved. In March 1955, exactly 12 years after the Sentinel sinking, Sullivan organized a reunion for survivors of the destroyer. 43 men traveled to Boston for the gathering, sharing stories and honoring the 98 crew members who died that night in the freezing Atlantic waters. Major attended as the guest of honor, receiving pats and treats from sailors who remembered his heroism. Several survivors credited the intelligence Major saved with protecting their subsequent convoy missions, as the improved routing kept them away from U-boat patrol areas. The reunion strengthened bonds between men who shared trauma and survival, creating a support network that lasted for decades. During the reunion, Captain Morrison, who had commanded the Sentinel, presented Sullivan with the ship's bell, recovered by Navy divers in 1953. Morrison explained that Sullivan and Major embodied the finest traditions of naval service, refusing to abandon duty even when death seemed certain. The bell became a centerpiece in Sullivan's home, a tangible reminder of the 270 men and one dog who served aboard the Sentinel. Sullivan rang the bell every March 22nd at the exact time the ship sank, a private ceremony honoring those who did not return from the Atlantic depths. Major passed away peacefully in his sleep on June 14, 1955, at the age of 12. Sullivan buried him in the backyard beneath an oak tree, marking the grave with a stone engraved with Major's name, service dates, and the words, "faithful unto death." Catherine held Sullivan as he wept, releasing years of gratitude and grief for the animal who had been his partner, savior, and friend. Local newspapers published obituaries for Major, recounting his wartime heroism and post-war contributions to military dog advocacy. The Office of Veterans Affairs sent an official letter of condolence, recognizing Major's service and sacrifice to the nation. Sullivan struggled with Major's death more than he anticipated. The house felt empty without the German shepherd's presence, and Sullivan's evening walks seemed pointless without his companion. Catherine suggested adopting another dog, but Sullivan resisted, feeling that no animal could replace Major. Instead, he channeled his grief into expanding his advocacy work for military working dogs. He contacted the Department of Defense and proposed establishing a formal recognition program for combat dogs, similar to human military decorations. His proposal gained support from veterans organizations and animal welfare groups nationwide. In 1957, the Department of Defense established the Military Working Dog Medal of Honor, recognizing exceptional acts of courage by dogs in combat situations. Major was posthumously awarded the first medal during a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Sullivan accepted the award on Major's behalf, delivering a speech about the unbreakable bonds between handlers and their dogs. He argued that these animals were not merely equipment, but genuine service members, deserving of respect and remembrance. The ceremony received national media coverage, bringing renewed attention to military working dog contributions throughout American history. Sullivan's advocacy inspired other handler veterans to share their stories. A network of former dog handlers emerged, documenting the service of thousands of dogs across multiple wars. These efforts led to the creation of the United States War Dog Memorial Fund in 1960, which raised money to construct a permanent monument honoring military working dogs. Sullivan served on the board of directors, ensuring that Major's story remained central to the memorial's educational mission. The memorial was completed in 1963 at March Air Force Base in California, featuring bronze statues of handlers and dogs in combat positions. Sullivan retired from teaching in 1970 after 25 years in education. He dedicated his retirement to writing a comprehensive history of American military working dogs from World War I through Vietnam. The book, published in 1973 and titled Faithful Warriors, became required reading at several military training facilities. Sullivan documented Major's story in extensive detail, including interviews with British sailors from the HMS Achilles who participated in the rescue. The book preserved these accounts for future generations, ensuring that the sacrifices of dogs and handlers would not be forgotten as veterans aged and memories faded. Throughout his later years, Sullivan received invitations to speak at military graduations, veterans events, and animal welfare conferences. He always carried a photograph of Major and the steel case from the Sentinel, using these props to illustrate his talks about duty, loyalty, and courage. Young handlers approached him after these speeches, asking advice about building bonds with their dogs. Sullivan emphasized patience, consistency, and respect, explaining that dogs responded to genuine partnership rather than mere command. He estimated that he personally influenced the training philosophy of over 500 handlers during these speaking engagements. Sullivan also maintained relationships with Major's original family in Pennsylvania. He visited them annually, sharing updates about the ongoing impact of Major's legacy. The family had preserved Major's original collar from before military service, and they donated it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1975 for inclusion in a World War II exhibit. The exhibit featured Major's story alongside artifacts from the Sentinel and testimonials from intelligence officers explaining how the recovered documents changed the Atlantic campaign. Millions of visitors saw the exhibit over subsequent decades, learning about one German shepherd's extraordinary contribution to Allied victory. Richard Sullivan passed away in 1992 at the age of 70, surrounded by family in his Boston home. His obituary in the New York Times devoted 3 paragraphs to his wartime service with Major, recognizing their partnership as one of the most remarkable human-animal bonds in military history. Sullivan was buried in Massachusetts National Cemetery with full military honors, and veterans organizations placed a bronze plaque near his grave depicting a German shepherd, ensuring that visitors would learn about Major's story. Catherine placed Sullivan's Naval Commendation Medal and Major's collar in the casket, reuniting the partners in death. The legacy Sullivan and Major created continued flourishing long after both passed away. The training protocols they developed during World War II evolved into modern military working dog programs used by all branches of the United States Armed Forces. Current handlers study Major's Atlantic rescue during their initial training, learning about determination and mission focus under extreme conditions. The story has become legendary within the military working dog community, inspiring handlers to view their dogs as true partners rather than mere tools. This philosophical shift improved handler-dog bonding and increased operational effectiveness in subsequent conflicts. The intelligence documents Major saved remained classified until 1997, when the National Archives declassified World War II materials for historical research. Scholars analyzing the documents confirmed that the U-boat coordinates directly resulted in the destruction or capture of 11 German submarines and 4 supply vessels between March and July 1943. These losses forced Germany to withdraw submarine forces from certain Atlantic regions, opening supply corridors that sustained Britain during critical months before the Normandy invasion. Military historians concluded that Major's actions represented a legitimate turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. In 2004, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp series honoring American military working dogs. Major appeared on one stamp, depicted swimming with the steel case in his mouth, beneath the text "Courage has no boundaries." The stamp series raised awareness about modern military working dog programs and generated donations to organizations supporting retired military dogs. Schools across America used the stamps in lessons about World War II, introducing new generations to Major's story and the broader contributions of animals in warfare throughout history. Modern military working dog organizations continue honoring Major's memory through various initiatives. The Richard Sullivan and Major Memorial Scholarship provides financial assistance to veterinary students specializing in military working dog care. Annual awards recognize handlers who demonstrate exceptional dedication to their dogs, embodying the partnership Sullivan and Major exemplified. These ongoing tributes ensure that their story remains relevant and inspirational, connecting current handlers to the proud lineage of military working dogs, stretching back through decades of service and sacrifice. The steel case Major rescued from the Atlantic was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2009. The case occupies a place of honor in the museum's dog tag exhibit, exploring animal contributions to the war effort. Museum guides share Major's story with visitors, explaining how one German shepherd's refusal to abandon duty altered strategic outcomes and saved countless lives. The case's presence serves as a tangible link to that desperate night in March 1943, when loyalty and courage overcame impossible odds in the freezing Atlantic darkness. Major's legacy endures not merely as historical footnote, but as living inspiration for anyone who believes that dedication to duty and partnership can change the course of history.